Thank you to everyone who has joined. I just want to announce a couple of special guests we have in addition to the journalists, and that is Randall Kempner, CEO of the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation, and Kip Averitt, former Texas State Senator and former chair of the Senate Committee on Natural Resources. With that, we'll lead off with Mary Lou Hastings, Chief Innovation and Strategy Officer at the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation. Mary Lou, go ahead.
Thanks for joining us this morning. Thank you, David, and all of you all for being here to learn about the Respect Big Bend project and the report that we're rolling out today. The Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation, based in Austin, Texas, supports grantees and programs focused on water conservation, land stewardship, and clean energy, as well as responsible shale development in Texas, among other programs. Throughout the Respect Big Bend initiative, it's been a privilege to have the opportunity to work with my colleagues here today, Michael Young, David Ionelli, Melinda Taylor, Joe Kiesecker, Senator Kip Averitt, Billy Tarrant, Brett Holmes, Marita Mirzatuni, Louis Harbison, and many others. Their work will help ensure that decisions about energy development in the Big Bend region and around the world are made carefully and intentionally with full consideration and respect given to the impacts of that development on local community values and natural resources. You may know George Mitchell as an early pioneer in the development of oil and gas resources from shale. His work led to the most recent renaissance of development in the Permian Basin and beyond, despite even the decline in demand last year. Shale development made the Permian the largest producer of oil and gas in the world. One impetus for the Respect Big Bend project was Mr. Mitchell's admonition to me and the foundation board to develop a program to address the environmental and social impacts of shale development, most of which is occurring in remote and undeveloped areas. The foundation's view is that any negative impacts of development should be minimized so that the positive impacts of new reliable energy resources can be maximized. While this includes the high-profile issues of eliminating carbon dioxide and methane emissions, for our purposes, it also includes the often overlooked issues of exploitation of water resources and land degradation. The Mitchell family are also ardent land and species conservationists. Now, as part of the Mitchell Foundation, they have a 7,000-acre land conservancy north of the Woodlands that they have restored to native habitat for a number of endangered species. They now have one of the largest populations of endangered red-cockaded woodpeckers on private property. The Mitchells were also proponents of sustainable communities where access to green space and living with nature was assured. George Mitchell developed the Woodlands, now one of the most successful sustainable communities in the country. Another precursor to the RBB project that informed its design was the Foundation's partnership with the Aspen Institute's Energy and Environment Program to explore best practices in energy governance. The resulting report from this three-part dialogue series included action-oriented recommendations and a principles-based energy governance framework. The key conclusion of the series is that sustained interaction between regulators, communities, and researchers can enable more effective governance and management of energy resources. Community stakeholder access to balanced research and data is particularly valuable. Another impetus for the Respect Big Bend project is more personal. I'm from Midland and my parents lived there for over 40 years. My dad was a petroleum engineer with ARCO for 35 years. I've seen and been personally impacted by the boom and bust cycle of oil and gas development and its other positive and negative impacts. I've seen how it inflates and then implodes communities, resources, and families. The Big Bend region itself has played an important part of my life personally as well. So when I started hearing about energy development in new areas of the Permian, both fossil energy and renewable, I started to explore the questions about the extent of this development, its impacts, and how the foundation might establish an effort to support community well-being and natural resource protection, all driven by stakeholder input and values. The RBB project was ultimately designed to be a test case of the energy governance approach outlined by the Aspen Institute report. Fortunately, Joe Kiesecker at the Nature Conservancy had an approach, development by design, that you'll hear about in a few minutes, to provide a framework for facilitating the science and stakeholder-driven approach that we sought. We knew that energy development decisions in Texas are made between mineral rights owners and energy companies, with minimal regulatory oversight or authentic community engagement. This asymmetrical balance of power leads to inefficient sharing of benefits and costs. With Respect Big Bend, we set out in search of a more balanced approach that takes into account other stakeholders in the region and their values while holding private property rights paramount. Today, science-based community engagement will become critically important during the proposed transition from meeting increasing energy demand with fossil fuels to meeting that demand with expanded renewable and next generation clean energy technologies and policies. We are familiar with the impacts of traditional energy development, but clean energy technologies in the transition also have significant implications for rural areas in particular, which have large tracts of land necessary to deploy clean energy technologies at scale. Solar installations, wind farms, carbon capture and sequestration, geothermal, and even rare earths mining are all located in undeveloped areas. The transition from fossil fuels to clean energy will still have a disproportionate impact on small communities and surrounding natural resources. The RBB process respected the economic benefits that accrue to landowners from new sources of income. However, we particularly aim to include rural community members who are outside of the power structure that maintains the economic status quo, a status quo that is no longer sufficient or fair as energy development continues to expand into new and undeveloped areas and rural communities. The Respect Big Bend process and recommendations reflect that rural areas will be better off if the private and regional economic benefits of energy development are balanced by a comprehensive and science-based, local stakeholder-driven engagement process that ensures that local values are reflected in energy development decisions. So to help us launch our conversation, I'd like to show you a 3-minute video that highlights a few of the issues that we'll discuss today. Thank you, David.
The Trans-Pecos is iconic Texas.
Wide open spaces and rugged individualism.
You see stars differently out there. It really is like you're leaving into a different world. From a landowner and a ranching perspective, very self-reliant, more a fabric of their DNA.
It's known as one of the most biodiverse regions in the country, potentially in the world.
We still have intact ecosystems, and we still have these large ranches and these beautiful vistas and the dark skies. So it's coveted properties.
And what's happening now is that the character of that landscape is markedly changing.
The Permian Basin oil field yielded almost 30 billion barrels of oil and 75 trillion cubic feet of natural gas.
When you look at all the different plays that are there, is one of the biggest reservoirs in the world.
There are more and more wind turbines, very large solar facilities, transmission lines, pipelines, new roads, and infrastructure. It's an industrialized landscape.
We gained 7 motels in 18 months.
The area of Midland, Odessa is trying to keep up with housing. 2-bedroom apartments costing more than $2,000 a month, and some say that's not even the start of it.
These small communities have never seen anything like it.
You don't really see it until you're in the middle of it, and sometimes that's too late.
The impact is happening predominantly to families who have been on the land for generations.
the growing footprint from energy to meet our ever-growing demand for energy. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge we have to recognize.
There's this whole national narrative right now on the value and the impacts of natural gas and oil versus renewables. All of that is now centered in West Texas.
As we develop new innovations, this same issue is going to come to communities across the nation.
Once you get it wrong, it's really hard to go back. That's what many of us fear will happen if the status quo is followed.
What we're doing at the Mitchell Foundation has the potential to be a template for energy development around the world.
We need to rethink everything. I hope that we have started soon enough.
Okay, with that, we'll turn this over to Melinda Taylor, Professor of Law at the University of Texas Law School.
Okay, and I'm gonna be brief because Mary Lou has given you all a very good sort of overview of the RBB process. But just to emphasize a couple of things, when we launched this project in 2019, the idea, as she alluded, was to get together, primarily give the community members as well as landowners in West Texas, an opportunity to work closely with scientists, with conservation organizations, with energy industry representatives to develop a vision, a blueprint for what development in West Texas would look like. We always felt like it was important. We always recognized that energy development is important to the economy of Texas, important to the economy of West Texas. But we also were committed to this idea that it could be done responsibly and it could be done in ways that would minimize the negative impacts that often come along with energy development. The process we used, which Joe Kiesecker and Michael Young will talk about in a bit more detail, is this development by design process that the Nature Conservancy has pioneered and has used elsewhere in the US and also elsewhere in the world. And it's kind of these 4 very kind of concrete steps, all of which are critical to a successful outcome. But that creating a conservation vision, that's based first and foremost on what the community members value most about the region where they live. And you'll see in a minute the particular values that the stakeholder advisory group in West Texas identified as part of this Respect Big Bend process. We ground that vision in the best science that's available about, in our case, things like wildlife habitat, corridors for wildlife, ecotourism, the rural sort of attributes of a community, and map those things using some very sophisticated GIS mapping techniques, and then marry that with projections about future energy development. And Michael Young will describe that in a bit more detail. But we using the best available science about the geology of the region, about the potential of the region to support solar development and wind development, we can make projections about where that development is likely to occur, and therefore where that development is likely to impact those conservation values that the community has identified as being most important. And then finally, we kind of, once you've got the best information that you can possibly derive, it's possible to come up with mitigation strategies, ways to reduce whatever negative impacts might be associated with that development. So this whole process is really premised on the notion that if you give community members and landowners a chance to sit at the table and sort of say, articulate their vision for their part of the world, and you make that vision something that the energy industry is aware of, that the industry can make decisions that will result in a much less sort of impactful decisions about development on the landscape. And I think I'm going to stop there just so that we can hear a little bit more about the stakeholder advisory process and the science that was used to develop and sort of take us through these steps.
Great, thanks, Melinda. Next up, Billy Tarrant, Associate Director of Stewardship Services at the Borderlands Research Institute at Sul Ross State University. Go ahead, Billy.
And unmute myself. Thank you all for this opportunity to visit with you. I have a very short bit here on the Stakeholder Advisory Group. It's nowhere indicative of how involved this process has been. We're sitting on about 13 or 14 meetings now with several hours in each one, and a true commitment from these folks that have helped us through this process, which includes citizens from the Tri-County area, Brewster, Jeff Davis, and Presidio counties, local leaders, especially landowners / ranchers, and some of our conservation partners as well. Very well represented by these different constituent groups. I will say this: I wanted to mention that they were picked because they're very influential and sit on a lot of committees and councils, etc. And they started every conversation with saying how busy they were, but not a single one turned us down. They all thought this was extremely important. So some of the guidelines that we provided them are listed there. One of the things that I am most proud of is we were very clear that we knew we had significant liberals and conservatives in the room, and we were going to minimize the political discussion and try to find commonalities and talk about the values that we all cherish about this region which we live. And I would say it's been probably the most rewarding part of my career to be associated with these folks. They've done a fantastic job. Right in the middle of it, we encountered the pandemic. And luckily, we were able to start with face-to-face meetings for several of our meetings, and really were able to establish this trust that they utilize throughout the entire process. And we're hopeful that our next meeting will be our first one in person in over a year, but we were able to persevere through, and they've been very, very, what's the word I'm looking for, helpful in this process beyond our wildest dreams. The primary thing that they did for us is it's one slide, but it took a long time to get here. For the first time that I'm aware, or any of us are aware, these are the values that these folks cherish about the Trans-Pecos region of Texas, this area in far west Texas, is the values that you see right there. And they're not listed in any priority. It became very evident from day one when we began to have these discussions that the ranching heritage of the area is what provides so many more of these values. It's somewhat of an umbrella value for the rest, everything else you see there in some way, shape, or form or fashion. The ranching heritage provides intact landscapes that we don't see in other parts of the state or even the country. These large ranches that are still working, cattle ranches, give us our clean air, our clean water, our unimpacted land, view sheds, etc. So we basically were able to meet virtually and continue what we were doing, and I'm very proud of the efforts. These values were then transformed into the most appropriate spatial attributes that were available, and for that, we'll kick it back to David.
So with that, we will turn this over to Michael Young, Senior Research Scientist at the Bureau of Economic Geology, Jackson School of Geosciences at the University of Texas at Austin. Go ahead, Michael.
Thank you. And I actually unmuted beforehand. I feel like I've advanced the process. Thanks for everybody for being here. As was talked about earlier, the development by design comes in really in 4 steps: conservation vision, which Billy just talked about. And the outcome of that visioning process are maps like this. And this shows in green areas that are considered by the stakeholder group to be a very high value. And the purple are land areas that have less value. And this is based on the, on feedback from multiple meetings from the stakeholders. And with this map, we can come away with a clear picture of areas of high values, low values, things like that. And we then developed a process for assessing where suitable energy resources are located. And this was done at the Bureau with a lot of discussion of different stakeholders, industry, and so on. And we built different scenarios given levels of exploration for oil and gas, for wind, and for solar. And the scenarios were built with a target of 30 years into the future, which helps us to account for uncertainties in commodity prices, conservation activities, among other things. And this long view also gives us an opportunity for incorporating regional balances of land versus development because of these are all going to be occurring at the same time. And once we identify these areas, we can then overlay where the energy development is going to occur on top of these maps of land values. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see a sort of a map of oil and gas development, of projected oil and gas development over the next 30 years out to 2050. And the darker the color, the larger the percentage of per acre, per square kilometer of land that will be altered from oil and gas development. And a couple things that you can sort of take away. One is that there's a relatively low likelihood of concentrated exploration in the Tri-County area. Even though some drilling has occurred, most of the rest of the Permian Basin and the Delaware Basin that most people are hearing about in the news these days, that's likely to continue, subject to economics. What is the cost per barrel of oil, the cost per a BTU of gas and cubic feet of gas. And so the key takeaway here is that land alteration generally is occurring, the land itself is occurring above where the oil and gas is found underground. It's like you have to drill vertically more or less down to where the oil and gas is. And if we look at renewable energy in the next slide, one of the things to note is that that graph on the left shows where solar energy could occur if we focused really on what we would call solar irradiance. How sunny is it in West Texas? And it's sunny in most places. It's a little bit sunnier further to the west than it is closer to Midland, but all of these areas are suitable for solar development. And the graph on the right shows where solar energy could be constructed if we only considered access to transmission lines. And you see really big differences between where, the likelihood of solar energy development based on the criteria that companies are using right now to determine where they might want to site a facility. And there are a lot of factors, that we are not able to account for in our kind of estimation of where solar energy might go. But it does give us an opportunity to show stakeholders, companies, and so on, the relative effect of how they value different criteria. And we will then overlay that on top of the conservation values that you saw before. And so in the next slide, we just kind of look at how much land are we talking about over the next approximately 30 years? If we were to add all oil and gas, wind and solar in terms of, and you can see in the green bar, that's sort of the high land alteration scenario, the brownish bar, tan bar, that's kind of the low alteration scenario. So you're seeing a range of what might occur in the future. But I think that the key takeaway here is on the top left where it says 3.1 to 25% of very low and low asset class areas could accommodate all of the energy development that's kind of expected over the next 30 years. So in other words, there's plenty of land of even lower asset value classes that would be available for development. And so there's a couple takeaways. First, because of the large amount of land areas out there, high value landscapes can be preserved and kept intact when siting these new facilities. So there's options. Second, there's a really strong influence of the placement of transmission lines because the proximity to transmission lines are very important for renewable energy because that's where the electrons need to connect up to the ERCOT grid. The third point is that the value of land restoration and about thinking early on about land restoration in the planning of energy development to restore the land so that the higher value, the land asset maintains its quality. And then finally, there's a lot of opportunities for negotiation and conflict avoidance here. And as Mary Lou mentioned, we really are focusing on the intentionality of the decision making, and this process of overlaying, here's the land that's the assets that are valued, and here's where we think that there may be land alteration, that can work effectively in the context of any type of energy development. And so with that, I'm going to pass this back over to David, who I think he's going to talk and have Joe do a demonstration. Thank you.
With that, I'm going to turn it over to and turn also control here over to Joe Kiesecker, who is lead scientist at the Nature Conservancy.
So in April 2019, the US produced more electricity with renewables than coal for the very first time. The energy transition that's happening is largely being driven by the cost of electricity generation. So based on the levelized cost of energy, about 2 years ago, onshore wind and solar became the cheapest form of new installed electricity. So at the same time, due to technological advances like fracking, natural gas is also pushing electricity generation away from coal and towards gas. But these cheaper forms of energy are more diffuse, and so they have a larger land footprint, requiring a solution to address the potential energy sprawl and land use conflicts that may arise. So as Mary Lou mentioned, Mitchell Foundation brought the Nature Conservancy in to use an approach that we call development by design. It's an approach we've used in the US as well as about a dozen plus countries around the world. Development by design, or DBD, is all about moving development planning away from small spatial scales that only consider the impacts of individual projects to larger landscape scales to assess cumulative impacts, and from what is largely a reactive process to a proactive process that anticipates impacts and preemptively attempts to reduce conflicts and provide solutions. Stakeholder engagement, I think, as everyone has said, is crucial for this process to work. Part of our theory of change is that if people, decision makers, have access to information about the values and how future development may potentially impact those values, that information can be incorporated into their decisions. So in addition to the reports that document the process, we attempt to create decision support tools that can allow access to the information. And so if you're seeing my screen, you're seeing a map and a decision support tool that was built to help support the project. Users can examine the spatial patterns associated with each layer. So you can turn the data on and off, and we have basically all the layers that are in the report, that are documented in the report, in the tool. So you can look at, where are intact landscapes. Let's see, it's not showing up there. Finally, there might be a little bit of a delay just because of the, from punting from my computer to Zoom and out to everyone. You can also start to look at how the layers interact together. And so, but I'll just quick walk through each of these. So we have ecological, social, the energy layers, the projections that Michael discussed, as well as other data, basic things like county boundaries, dark skies. You can start to look, though, about how these data layers, like I said, interact. So let's just say, if you want to understand where springs are important for, say, mule deer habitat, you can look at the interaction between those. A lot of this stuff I think you'd want to do in a GIS environment. The goal, though, was to allow people who don't have GIS skills to still be able to interact and play with the data. We can also start to get into understanding how the future energy patterns may impact some of the values. And so one of the core ones, which colleagues have already mentioned, were intact landscapes. These intact landscapes provide wildlife habitat, open space, vistas, but they're supported by those large working ranches. So we can start to look at how some of the energy futures may impact those values. And let's see if I can turn on one of them. It might take a second. And so I chose one of BEG's oil and gas scenarios, and we can look and see in Pecos, Reeves, and Culberson County, there's some interaction with some of those intact landscapes and some of the future development patterns. You can highlight some of these things before they create conflicts and start to think about mitigation solutions to minimize or avoid those conflicts altogether. You can also use this tool and this data set as a way to prioritize where future SAG interactions might need to occur. So we focus on this Tri-County area, Presidio, Brewster, and Jeff Davis, but if you start to look at some of where these future energy patterns may intersect, you can start to think about where you might want to do another engagement process like was done for the SAG with the Tri-County area. There's a lot of data, a lot of information behind these data layers, as you can see if you dive into the report, but we also try to add as much access to information as possible, including ways to sample the data. So I just want to really quick walk through something we call area of interest. So for example, if you're a developer and you're looking at multiple wind or solar energy sites, you can start to screen those sites for conflicts with the values, get a quick report back. So you can actually do this by either uploading a shape file and just dropping it into that box, or you can start sketching with your cursor. And I'm just going to grab an area here, draw a polygon. That's not exactly the shape that I wanted to draw, but you get the basic idea. And then click run analysis on shape. It's doing this in real time, so it takes about 30 seconds or so. But what it's going to do is give you a report back for the area of the different values that's within that polygon. So you can imagine, again, a wind developer who wants to screen those projects to try to reduce impacts or reduce conflicts can undertake that type of analysis. And hopefully it will takes about 30 seconds or so typically, but yeah, there you go. God bless the internet. And so, you could imagine doing this for a variety of projects. Again, it gives you a report back on all those values that we've included in our analysis that were identified by the SAG. That's all I have. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and kick it back to you, David.
Great. Thanks very much, Joe. And we'll do a quick turn here to Melinda Taylor to wrap things up. And then when we're done with that, we'll go to Q&A. So go ahead, Melinda.
Sure. Yeah. So just really quickly, I think you can see from Joe's demonstration, the assemblage of data that is contained there in that tool that he just quickly demonstrated for you all, we think can be really a powerful tool for citizens in West Texas who are interested in just understanding the landscape better, as well as energy developers who want to have a quick, clear sense of where those important resources are. And hopefully, again, the idea would be that they could take steps to avoid impacting those important resources once they have all that information at their fingertips. So just really quickly, the high-level recommendations that the stakeholder advisory group endorsed from this process, and I'll just wrap up with this before we open it up for questions, are that they kind of recognized that this process was very important and want to see it replicated in other places. So their endorsement was that stakeholder input be obtained in other parts of West Texas and other parts of the state in order to avoid those negative impacts of energy development. The second big recommendation was that a center be established, some entity that could carry on, if you will, and continue to provide a forum for community members, landowners, energy companies, et cetera, to do this sort of large scale planning to avoid the negative impacts of energy development. Third recommendation was to use this tool in addition to siting decisions on the front end to prioritize areas for land restoration. As Texas goes through an energy transition, it might take 30 years in Texas to move away from oil and gas to renewable forms of energy development. There's a lot of land that's been disturbed. There are a lot of oil and gas wells that are abandoned that could potentially be sources of groundwater contamination. And this sort of decision tool can be a very useful mechanism for prioritizing areas for restoration and protection. And then finally, just recognizing the importance of these large working heritage ranches in West Texas, the group felt like it was important to sort of support incentive type programs, government programs, and things like conservation easements to keep those big ranches intact, because they really do provide a lot of natural resource value for the whole state as well as for the region. So I think I'll stop there and would love to hear any questions that you have.
Terrific. Thanks, Melinda. And yes, we'll be happy to take any questions you have now. If just when you ask your question, we'd love to your name and your media outlet.
I'll jump in if nobody else is going to. This is Travis Fubenik with Marfa Public Radio here in West Texas. And I have a million questions. There's obviously so much here, and thanks for doing this. But I guess this one is for Melinda. I think a key question that comes to my mind just going forward is, so if this is a roadmap for development in the future, do you have any notable oil companies, solar companies, notable landholders, like specific companies that have, bought the map, who have said, okay, we'll use it, we'll put money into this effort? Have you got those commitments yet?
Well, a couple of oil companies were part of our stakeholder advisory group. So Apache and Conoco were part of our process. I think I know what you're asking, Travis, and I guess the short answer is no. We don't have a list of folks who have agreed at this point to employ this tool in their future development decisions. One of the things that we learned pretty early on in the RBB process, and it was kind of a surprise, frankly, but was that there is not likely to be a lot of oil and gas development in the Tri-County area. So we sort of recognized that, and in a way that was freeing, because we weren't sort of at the crossroads of a big area of conflict when we were going through this process. And we were able to kind of think about how the tool could be used going forward. But I think the next step, which would be critically important, would be to take this tool to a particular play or a particular area where there is some energy development planned, and to test it in that context. And that, our hope is that again, the community and other stakeholders would find this a useful mechanism for doing that. So we'll see, but I think that's the next logical step, and that's where this process should be taken. I mean, Nature Conservancy has experience in the Marcellus in Pennsylvania in working in particular areas where there's development underway and in place, and companies have agreed to go along with the outcome of the application of the tool and using it elsewhere as well. So we're optimistic that that'll happen, but we don't have our list of 5 companies who have endorsed this at this point and agreed to use it going forward.
Yeah, that's fair. My only other question then briefly is just, why no recommendations for regulations, eminent domain reform, that sort of thing?
That's a great question. And I think, again, we were looking for, in this particular stakeholder group, it was first and foremost important for us to have consensus around a core set of recommendations. And I think it's fair to say, we told the stakeholders from the beginning that we weren't aiming for a regulatory outcome, that we were more interested in getting their input about putting together those values maps, and the data layers, which frankly has never been done in Texas anyplace else. So we felt like compiling that information in a way that could be usable and replicable was more important than coming up with a policy type recommendation. Now, that being said, I think there are certainly members of our stakeholder advisory group and a number of other, organizations and individuals around the state who are very interested in eminent domain reform, in a surface damage act, which Texas is the only shale producing state in the country that doesn't have a surface damage act that protects landowners whose land is developed by oil and gas operators. I mean, there are a whole range of policy solutions that one could discuss and probably recommend. But for this particular process, we just decided early on it was more important to have consensus really around those values and to get the good science out there into the world that could be used by others. So.
Okay, well, thank you. That's all I have for right now.
Thanks, Travis. Any other questions?
Hi, this is Keith Schneider calling from Michigan with Circle Blue. A little bit more than a year ago, we did a project in this very area and wrote a whole, piece, one of the 6 pieces we did with this project that also was funded by the Mitchell Foundation. And it basically said what you guys are saying, that the risk of oil and gas development and maybe clean energy development, at least for the time being, is not nearly as high as what maybe the foundation initially thought when it started this project. My question, looking at this data, is it kind of assumes that wind and solar development is going to be centralized. That is, it's going to be developed under these very large energy installations, energy generation, electrical generation installations. That may not be what happens in the industry, given the technological development of both those 2 renewables and others. It may be a decentralized system because of the cost of transmission, the cost of putting up these large multi-hundred acre facilities. The third thing is that my assessment a year ago also, which was confirmed by the data that you show, is that with the exception of the solar farm in Brewster County, it didn't look like any of the 3 Big Bend counties were going to be big renewable centralized installation development zones. That's great for that area. It will retain all of the values that you guys that this study has shown. Fourth thing I want to say is that here in Michigan in the 1970s, the state developed a planning process, not nearly as sophisticated as the one that we just saw, to protect the Pigeon River State Forest. And it was enabled to do that because it owned the land and the mineral rights in the forest. And Shell Oil, which was then the big developer of the Niagaran Formation, which at that time was the largest, oil development program campaign on the continent, wanted to develop the entire forest, 100,000 plus acres. And the governor at the time, Bill Milliken, a Republican, and his wife, Helen Milliken, championed a program to confine the development to the southern part of the forest, about 10% of it, and the number of wells to a minimal number, like 20, also directional drilling. So the country and states have been engaged in trying to manage these kinds of diverse, magnificent landscapes for sustainable, more ecologically practical environmental values. And so what's happening in West Texas is large, has merit, can be used in other parts of the country, maybe the world, but it is part of an ongoing history of trying to do this.
David, or Michael, I think you should talk a little bit about the centralized versus distributed energy development thing. But I will say, Keith, I think that's a really good point about what's happened in Michigan. We've also seen it elsewhere where people have successfully, or whether it's state government or community organizations, have successfully pressured the industry to move away from sensitive areas. The point here, though, is that Texas, in the Permian, there has really been, as far as we're aware, no significant effort to try to centralize or protect key parts of that landscape in West Texas. And, in Texas, I think the chances of doing that through a regulatory process are zero, right? So, we felt like from a strategic standpoint, and, being as practical as possible, our best shot at doing that was to empower those local communities with the information that they need. At the end of the day, we're kind of betting on those community members to be able to use this information that's now at their fingertips to work with energy companies and make that happen. But this is a first for Texas. So we're hopeful and optimistic that it can work here.
Well, east of the Mississippi River and here in Michigan and several other states, we are seeing sort of a small trend toward a distributed generation.
Right.
Hopeful distributed generation.
Yeah.
We have towns that are building their own solar fields and erecting their own wind farms on much smaller pieces of property. And that's not a transmission piece because the East is full of, we have plenty of transmission lines everywhere. So I'm just wondering, in West Texas, given that the transmission lines are going to have to be newly built, right? If they're going to get down into Brewster and Presidio and down in the Big Bend. And, will technology, you're talking, your time horizon is 3 decades. And if there's one thing about America is that it has no continuity, right? America has no continuity. Things change radically from decade to decade. 3 decades from now, Lord, maybe it will be decentralized. Maybe it will be centralized, but my sense is it won't be centralized. It will be a much more distributed system, not needing the kinds of expensive infrastructure that is required for putting up, 500-acre or 1,000-acre wind farms or solar facilities out there. Maybe not, but anyway, just a thought.
So can I respond really quickly? And the question of distributed versus utility, Keith, it's good to see you. We did capacity modeling to inform the number of facilities that we expect across this entire region of the ERCOT grid, which is known as ERCOT region number 2. So we did account for some increase in distributed, but you're right, we don't know for sure how pricing structures, how communities are going to feel about these really large areas going forward. The ERCOT planning horizon, their long-term system assessment is about 15 years, but they typically are really looking at 2 to 4 year chunks of time where they're going to put the transmission lines. So one of our takeaways is the importance of discussing with community leaders and stakeholders where the power lines should go, because the facilities are going, utility scale facilities are going to follow closely behind that. The second point is it's true that there are some power lines and transmission lines already out in the Tri-County. There are communities out there that are part of the grid, but they're kind of dependent on things they can't control. So they've been stringing some of their own transmission lines out there down to the city of Presidio. There's one that's going south from Alpine down to the southeast. So there are some lines going that are being constructed, but how they go forward in time over the next 20 to 30 years is difficult to predict. You're right that that governments change and policies are changing, but this does give us, I think, an opportunity to imagine futures, and then we can then help to shape what that future looks like. And I see that as the value of these data layers.
Yeah, and I guess just the last point on that, though, is that ERCOT is, there's a huge amount of utility scale solar in ERCOT's queue, right, for hooking up to transmission. And even during the pandemic last year, from March or whatever through the end of the year 2020, there was a tremendous growth in new wind power that was brought online. So it may be that at some 30, 40 years in the future, we're seeing a lot more distributed development in Texas, and there already is a fair amount of development, but it's extraordinary how much large scale renewable power is being built out in West Texas still. So anyway, I think we're not seeing a slowdown or a dramatic shift to distributed construction yet, at least.
Can I throw in real quick? Keith, good to see you again. Billy Tarrant with BRI. You brought up a good point about changing how policy changes, how directives change and incentives change through time. And it's actually come from our stakeholder advisory group as well, that this tool, this effort has to be dynamic, and it will continue to be dynamic. As projections change, as priorities for development change, this tool will change, and there has to be a way, which is one of the primary reasons for the recommendation of the center, to house the tool and continue to engage stakeholders from now on in the region. So just want to clarify that they saw that as well, and we're very clear about that it cannot be static. It cannot be a one shot and done. It has to be continually updated, et cetera.
I think it's a really elegant tool, and its application is so useful, particularly here in Michigan, where we're going to be a climate refuge for all you Texans. We're going to be abandoning, the 125-degree days that are coming 30 years from now, right?
Yes. Very true.
Are there any other questions? If not, thank you everyone for joining today. We really appreciate it. And if you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out through Brett. Enjoy the rest of your day. Have a good one.